Right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first panel today, which is on cognitive threats and democratic resilience. My name is Isabel Bormister. I am an assistant professor of international relations at the University of Amsterdam, and I have the privilege and honor to moderate this panel this morning. Here with me on my right is Ilaria Carrozza. She's a senior researcher here at PRIO who studies the governance of emerging technology, in particular the use of AI by authoritarian states to manipulate public opinion and suppress dissent. Thank you for joining us, Ilaria. Then we have Stine Bergersen. She's also a senior researcher here at PRIO and focuses on how digital technologies, online ecosystems, and societal vulnerabilities shape the spread and impact of disinformation in democratic societies. And then on the end of the other end of the panel, we have Jan Kleiner, who is assistant professor of political science at Masaryk University. And he is he examines international security, strategic competition, cybersecurity, and the use of influence and information tools in geopolitics. So three well-versed experts on the topic that we're talking about this morning. A little bit of practical information for those of you that are in the room. The panel also takes place online. It's being live streamed and also recorded. That is for your information. Welcome to everyone that is online. And if you are in the room, I am supposed to point out the fire exits for you, which are from your view on the right-hand side and on the back of the room. And I guess if you are watching from home or your office, you also know where your fire exits are there. So, without further ado, I'm going to start off the panel with a round of questions, but we have reserved time at the end for questions from the audience, so that our experts can give answers to those as well. The first question that we're going to start off with is how should democracies define cognitive threats so as to include malign influence, but also ensure that ordinary disagreement and distrust of governments isn't treated as being a security issue? And I'm going to ask Stine to start us off.
Yes, thank you. I thought I would start with a little bit of background. And also a disclaimer, because I will be speaking mainly from a Norwegian point of view, which is the context in which I have looked at this. And as the status is in Norway, is that I would say that progress is being made in this area, but that vulnerabilities are also to some extent increasing. And in all this, I think it's important to underline that definitions matter. It's not only about semantic or academic value, it matters. But a great deal is already on the way. In recent years, I think Norway has taken some important and necessary steps to that collectively will help strengthen our resilience against influence operations, and with disinformation as being a component of that. The issue is anchored in frameworks such as the National Security Strategy, a dedicated strategy against disinformation, and the report from the Total Preparedness Commission, and so on. The Norwegian Media Authority has been given a clearer mandate and greater responsibility, and EU regulations such as the Digital Services Act are being integrated. But then the challenges are also significant because societal trust is under increasing pressure. The recent 2026 citizen survey, so Innbyggerundersøkelsen, shows that trust in public administration has declined for the second year in a row and now stands at 51%, which is a drop of 11% from since 2021. And at the same time, importantly, trust between citizens has also fallen from 78% to 72%. So more and more people feel that other people cannot be trusted. And also threat awareness is increasing. The perceived risk of disinformation in the G7 countries has risen from 15th place in 2022 to third place in 2026, according to the Munich Security Report. And this is based on a list of risks, which risks people think their country is facing. So there seems to be a broad agreement that of the fact that disinformation and hybrid threats are a serious problem. And in all this, what I'm interested in is not so much the threat actors, the technical aspects, or even the traditional countermeasures, but in understanding what kind of phenomenon this problem actually is, and what we can possibly do to, of course, limit not the existence of the threat, because I find that a bit unrealistic of an ambition, and I will probably get back to that later, but to reduce the negative effects of this threat. So I think it's useful to distinguish between countering disinformation as a phenomenon and mitigating the negative effects of disinformation. And another reason why this is important is, or relevant, is that the research also shows that false information spreads faster than verified facts, that it can be produced much quicker, and that people also sometimes share information that they know is false, to build a certain image, to reinforce their own beliefs, or just to provoke. So definitions are important, and I think one approach to thinking about definitions is to think about what we want to protect, and I think it's valuable to start with the values we want to be protected. So trust, transparency, democracy, social cohesion, and so on. And these are obviously things that we cannot take for granted in the current state of things. Yeah, I think I will leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you, Stine. Then you can hand the microphone over to Jan, maybe.
Yeah, I will build on that. And in Czech Republic, we are not so profoundly interested in, or the political representation is not profoundly interested in the disinformation right now, because we have a populist government that surpassed the government that was kind of interesting in disinformation. So we're not on that in that good spot as the Nordics and or Finns and countries like that. What was said is important. The definitions matter, and I would add that for countries to be effectively countering threats like disinformation, propaganda, and stuff like this, it's important to notice that it's a long-term influence on populations. That we've already had terms like psychological warfare, influence operations, hybrid warfare, and all these buzzwords that recur throughout the years. But what is new in the cognitive dimension, or the cognitive warfare, cognitive security, is the focus on the long-term influence, long-term epistemological decay of the population. And this must be emphasized because it matters profoundly for the countermeasures that can be applied against these measures that are targeting Western democracies.
Thanks. Ilaria?
Thank you. I will also caveat my remarks today by saying that I do look at all of the topics that you listed before, but from a very particular perspective of China, and in this context, Taiwan. So everything that I will be saying draws from like practical experience of Taiwan. And I think this is really useful because Taiwan is the most studied case of democracy under sustained cognitive warfare. So I think the lessons learned that we can learn should be very useful for Europe and for a small country like Norway. So drawing from their example then, and following up on what my colleagues have just said, I think that democracies do need a concept or a definition of cognitive threat, cognitive warfare, because of course we know that adversaries, state or non-state alike, do deliberately manipulate information environments to degrade essentially democratic decision making. There is actually a definition that I really like from a paper published in the Journal of Global Security Studies by two Taiwanese scholars, not coincidentally, who define cognitive warfare as activities undertaken undertaken to manipulate environment stimuli to control the mental states and behaviors of enemies as well as followers in both hot and cold wars. And I'm citing their definition. So then, based on this understanding, one way to start distinguishing cognitive threats from genuine participation and sort of opposition in democratic context is perhaps to focus not so much on the content of the message, whether, again, it's a criticism of the state or a particular party or so on, but rather the method and the intent behind this. So, for example, if there is a foreign state or its proxies behind these activities, right, as opposed to, an opposition party or members of civil society, whether these activities are being intentionally concealed or hidden in any way. Do they rely on fabricated evidence or fabricated information, fabricated people, or online identities? Do they target specific democratic mechanisms, chiefly elections? And I can return to that later again, drawing from the Taiwan example. And also whether they are sustained over time and not just kind of happening occasionally. So I think all of these actions are different from legitimate critiques of the state and its organs. So ultimately, I don't think you can eliminate the tension between how wide you cast the net in terms of defining cognitive threat, not entirely at least. But of course, as Stina was saying, the element of trust is important in really setting the border somewhere there. But trust, I would say, is a necessary but not sufficient condition. And we also need to anchor any definition of cognitive threats into observable facts and behaviors.
Okay, thank you. So we've talked about trust, maybe as a necessary but not sufficient condition, but also the fact that it has declined, as you mentioned, Stina, right? That is very often the aim of disinformation campaigns, right? It is also to undermine trust and a shared understanding. So my next question would be to you: under what circumstances then these campaigns can be most successful or most likely to succeed, actually? And I'm going to start with Jan.
Well, I would say that the factors of success would be stemming mostly in the complex threat of all these things waved together, because it's a very complex phenomenon that must be emphasized here. I also come from a background of more cybersecurity focused studies on this phenomena. So I would emphasize the cyberspace as well, because all of these threats are very cyber enabled or cyber dependent. So that's one of the success factors. And basically the long-term issue of the epistemological decay and the trust, the targeting not only on the trust but legitimacy and reputation of the state and state institutions. The security forces, we've done research on security forces in Czech Republic, and it ended very badly with results. So these are the targets. Of course, the disinformation and cognitive threats target everyone, but there are specific groups that have more impact on the decision making, and by targeting them, you make your impact more profound on that society. So these are the factors that I would point out here.
Okay, thank you. Ilaria?
So I wanted to use the specific example of Taiwan to make a more general point, and that is that I would distinguish between being successful at achieving the intended objects, but also at what Stina was pointing to, which is creating negative effects in the longer term. And those are two very different things. So in Taiwan, Chinese cognitive warfare has as its objectives, strategic objectives, the exacerbation of internal divisions within Taiwan and political parties, weakening of Taiwanese people's resolve to fight in case of unification, influencing allies, particularly the US's willingness to support Taiwan militarily, particularly, and win support for China's policy. And I would argue that so far it has not been successful at achieving these strategic goals. Some concrete examples, I was talking about, I mentioned elections just a minute ago. So China launched a targeted influence campaign to influence the results of the national elections in Taiwan in 2024. And this was an extended operation at scale where something like 45,000 fake social media accounts posted more than 2 million pieces of disinformation. Think of the scale of that, right? And yet the candidate that Beijing most wanted not to win won in the end, the DPP's William Lai. Then there is the issue of broader public opinion and support for Taiwan's sovereignty, where a large majority of the Taiwanese people still continue to be opposed to unification with the PRC. There were some recent polls. The numbers I have is from a couple of years ago, but there's probably more updated polls as well. Or at least they were running it last year. I don't know if we have the results yet, but about 49% almost of the Taiwanese people support obtaining formal national independence, while a little bit less than 30% support maintaining the status quo, which is kind of this ambiguous policy where the PRC argues that there's only one China and that Taiwan is a part of it, but Taiwan is de facto administering it itself. It has its own constitutions and laws, etc. But only 11% supported unification with China. So despite, and these are just 2 of many examples, but despite not being able to achieve its strategic objectives, right, at influencing these perceptions, China's cognitive warfare is having longer-term negative effects that are very concerning. The most striking, perhaps, is on younger generations, or the TikTok generation specifically, because they are found to be more susceptible to Chinese propaganda. I mean, TikTok is a Chinese app, obviously, so it spreads a lot of misinformation, disinformation, but also pro-China friendly narratives. And a study by Double Think Lab, which is one of these sort of fact-checking civil society actors that's been doing really excellent work, found that active TikTok users, or of active TikTok users, about 45% agreed that cross-strait unification would not significantly impact their life. Or change their life, in any way. And I think this is a significant result, right? Then there's also the related question of the erosion of identity salience, where, for example, again, people in the age group 20 to 24 are no longer the age group with the strongest Taiwanese identity. This is a reversal of a long-standing trend, right? So many young people are also more passive and powerless, so they think, there's nothing we can do anyway, so might as well just accept it. At some point there will be unification. So I think that this all sort of circling back to my point that we need to both consider the explicit, perhaps shorter term effects, but also the longer term trends, which are perhaps equally important, if not more important.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I agree. Okay, so when likely to succeed? I think first the question is, I think the central issue here is obviously not that, if we look at this in the global scale, the issue is not so much whether democracies are under pressure, but how we as societies and institutions and organizations choose to respond. So the way I look at this, it's not so much about the threat again, but about the response to the threat. And if we think of democracy as, a house with load-bearing structures, influence operations and disinformation campaigns, they don't target the facade, they don't scrape off the paint, they go for the load-bearing structures and the structure of the house, which is made up of shared understanding of reality, institutional legitimacy, trust between people, trust in institutions, and so on. And how we choose to respond to these threats determines whether this structure will hold in the short run and in the longer run. So my overarching message, I think, is that it's not very controversial, I think, is that we should be focusing on doing things that we actually should be doing anyways. Things that already underpins democracy. And another good thing about doing that is that these are generally quite low-cost measures, where we have nothing to lose, in a sense. And why? Because influence succeeds where societies are already vulnerable. That's a very basic statement, but I think it needs to be mentioned. And also in the context of preparedness and total defense and these topics, we tend to talk about democracy as something which we must protect. For example, in the new Norwegian white paper on total preparedness. But I think you can also say, and it's important to remember, that democratic processes and values are also the protection. Which is also another argument for focusing on issues such as trust and institutional processes, journalistic methods, scientific methods that we are very concerned about. So transparency and social cohesion, and not just in addition to, in addition to what's also obviously important, which are the more technical countermeasures, fact-checking, and so on.
Yes, thank you. Before we come back to the question of democracy and democratic resilience, I wanted to ask all of you, but I'm going to start with Ilaria, because you already mentioned the scale, right? I wanted to ask about AI and what is genuinely new about these campaigns that you've mentioned as well, that very often extensively use AI.
Yes. Allow me some shameless self-promotion just to say that we have a new... Thank you, Nick, for nodding. That we have a new project at PRIO that we launched quite recently, and it's called Asia Tech, where we basically look at how AI-enabled tools stabilize autocracies and destabilize democracies, and the other way around, actually, but I can get to that later. And so we want to basically study how, again, state and non-state actors manipulate public opinion, conduct surveillance, and suppress dissent. And we have a specific focus on Asia, of course, but hopefully, the sort of the theoretical models that we will build will apply actually also. Our intention is to make them relevant also for Europe and elsewhere in the world. We just started the project, but we've had already a sort of a first round of reflections, and I wanted to share with you that our preliminary conclusion, at least on this first round of discussions, is that what's generally new about AI is less about persuasion and more about the scale, cost, and speed of the deception. Let me be more specific. So generative AI allows influence operations that once required large teams of humans, to be partially automated at least, so they can produce also more, these days, more convincing, more persuasive, and linguistically varied disinformation at a lower cost and a higher output, right? And China, but also notably Russia, actually, in the European context, I would say more Russia than China, but increasingly the latter as well, have both leveraged large language models and AI-generated media in this way. At the same time, however, we shouldn't overstate AI's novelty, at least for two main reasons. The first is that influence operations exploit, kind of going back to what Stina was saying, a vulnerability that predates AI, really. And that is the collapse of shared trust in our media and institutions. That has been happening for a long time. We don't need AI, ChatGPT, right, to tell us that the trust has decreased, right, in our societies. So generative AI accelerate this crisis of trust, but it didn't create it. So what we face is more fundamentally, I think, an epistemic problem, not merely a technological one. So how do we make sure that we can tell what's, truth or what isn't, right? The second reason is that the same dynamic that makes, and this is, I think, a crucial point in our research project specifically, is that the same dynamic that makes AI dangerous for democracies, right, the erosion of people's ability to know whom or what to believe, also creates governance problems for autocracies. So even authoritarian regimes, chiefly China, but others, depend on forms of public trust. I mean, in order for the famous social contract to stay alive, the Communist Party needs to know that the people trust them to do their job properly. And also it relies on an information environment that is saturated with uncertainty, and this can determine the legitimacy as well, the legitimacy of the governing party. So basically, in short, AI has influenced cognitive warfare information influence campaigns, and made them cheaper, faster, and harder to attribute. But its deepest effect, I think, is accelerating a pre-existing crisis of epistemic trust. That is a problem really for all regime types, not just for democracies.
Yes, I think I can add to that, because I think we need to broaden our understanding of how we understand influence and disinformation as one aspect of that, because these influence operations are evolving rapidly. And increasingly, these are not just attempts to spread false information, but to shape how people come to conclusions. And I would like to highlight one report I read recently, one of these chief scientists' report from NATO, to 2025 report, which warns that cognitive warfare is shifting from influencing what people believe to influencing how people decide what to believe. So these threats, they not only target what we know, but how we come to know and who we choose to trust. And this is sort of outside my area of expertise, so bear with me. But as I understand, this means that threat actors can use data and AI to subtly shape individuals' decision-making frameworks without relying on, obviously false content. And this makes, of course, this kind of influence very difficult to detect, as it's often experienced as self-generated or internally produced. So it becomes a form of influence that almost feels self-chosen, not about injecting propaganda into people's minds, but about shaping the architecture through which decisions are being made. And this is quite scary, I think. And if this indeed is the situation, and this will become better, or they will become better at it, then the boundary between external influence and internal conviction becomes much harder to draw. And of course, this is very challenging for our existing legal frameworks, institutional and security frameworks. And a former CIA Deputy Director, Jennifer Eubank, who many of you might already know, she argues for strengthening what she calls mind sovereignty. I think this is an interesting concept that I've been reading a bit about. And she defines this as the ability to recognize, understand, and protect our own cognitive processes. And the fact that NATO now highlights this in this concept in their report, I think in itself underscores the seriousness of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So far, we've been talking about states and this quasi-symmetrical conflicts and quasi-symmetrical influence. What I would point out here as well is that what makes AI revolutionary in this case is the empowerment of people. You can now write code, you can now write malware, stuff like this, which is, fortunately, when it comes to large language models, pretty much safeguarded by the guardrails, the ethical guidelines that the engineers put there. But we have also small language models. We have models that everyone can download to their computer. They can tell you without hesitation how to build a bomb. They can tell you how to create a narrative. They empower these individuals, lone wolves, if you will, to do influence operations with some impact, not like the large impact, but some impact. So this is something that should be emphasized as well, I think. You have jailbreaking of large linguistic models. So all these kinds of things lead to empowerment of individuals, not just the states that can wage operations. Everyone can wage influence operations right now. Everyone can launch cyber attacks if you overcome the small difficulties and venture into it. And that's not an issue even for people who are not technically trained. So this is something that we should be keeping an eye on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I wanted to come back to the question of democracy that Stine, you addressed in the previous question, and the importance of democratic resilience, right? Especially with regards to trust as well. And I was wondering if you can help us with any policies maybe that governments can use to actually strengthen resilience. Do you want to start, Stine?
Yeah, this is the $1 million question, yes. Right? What do we do? Yeah, it's a difficult question. I've already mentioned values, back to basic, but and I think it's important to keep in mind that what I just mentioned, that influence operations and disinformation do not always rely on lies, but it also operates by amplifying and framing and politicizing real but perhaps a bit limited problems. And one example of this happening was France, Paris, 2023 in the fall, when there were these concerns about bed bugs. You might remember this. And this was an issue that escalated quite dramatically. I mean, there were real cases of bed bugs in Paris, but the issue was amplified significantly through social media. It was linked to broader narratives of societal decay and migration and failure of governance and loss of control. And then later analysis pointed to networks connected to Russia, contributing to this amplification. And the challenge with this amplifying effect was not primarily that factual accuracy, because it was a fact that there was a problem with bed bugs in Paris, but how the information was framed and repeated and emotionally charged became the real issue. And in this case, because we often talk about fact checking as the primary measure aimed at strengthening, the public's critical media and information literacy, and improving the ability of citizens and journalists and so on to recognize this information. That's sort of the first line of defense. But in this particular case, a fact checking on the fact that Paris had a problem with bed bugs, but would not really solve the problem. So in terms of policy, I think efforts including fact checking is still important, but it's not sufficient when this type of influence is primarily about creating doubt, increasing polarization, and undermining trust, rather than to try to convince people of one specific falsehood. So. But it is important, and source criticism was, for example, in the Norwegian context, included in this self-preparedness advice issued by the Directorate for Civil Protection in 2024, and this is important because it sort of recognizes that the population is the first line of defense. And it also implicitly acknowledges that resilience is maybe matters more than control. But also a bit ironically, I can also mention that fact checking or these post hoc corrections may sometimes also unintentionally amplify falsehoods, because it can serve to increase their visibility rather than diminishing their appeal. So it's kind of like drawing attention to something that we're really trying to hide. Yep.
So the million-dollar question becomes, what are the policies to increase trust, right? And that is, Jan, do you want to help us out?
Yeah, that was really nice, actually. There is a very eloquent meta-analysis that builds on that or expands these insights, and that studied various measures that states or decision makers can apply against people's conspiracy mindset. And this meta-analysis came with four conclusions. The first one is that states or decision-making organs should avoid appealing to emotions and affect. And these interventions that are based on emotional manipulation of people are not effective. Every other conclusion that the meta-analysis mentions is about the thing that we've mentioned here throughout the discussion, and it's the long-term impact and long-term influence of the cognitive threats, that epistemological decay, slow epistemological decay. And this directly translates into the countermeasures that are most effective. And that is fact-based inoculation, long-term education of people, empowering them and their critical thinking skills. That takes a long time, so we are way beyond the attacking forces, if you will. this asymmetry, the asymmetry between the attacking forces and the defensive line that we have is the profound issue here, because people tend to call for immediate solutions to problems. But the education of people, the inoculation, the fact-based inoculation, it takes a long time. So this is where we are on a shorter end of the rope here, and that causes all the problems or majority of the problems that we have right here. So the other three countermeasures that the meta-analysis mentioned where counter-arguments are not effective as well. The immediate fact-checking, it has some kind of effect, but again, compared to the long-term inoculation, the critical thinking inoculation, it's not effective almost at all. Prevention is the best cure. That's what I was talking about, and that analytical mindset and critical thinking skills are the most effective means of challenging conspiracy beliefs. So this is something that creates the issues and the disproportion between the attacking side and the defensive side, and the disproportion in time the time requirements of the countermeasures that makes the problem even more profound here.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with a lot of what my colleagues have just said. So what do we do? Again, drawing from the Taiwanese example, and I think in many ways Norway is in a good position actually in terms of what policies can governments enact, right, to strengthen resilience, and perhaps elsewhere in Europe we could be doing a little more work on that. But so imagine in Taiwan you live under the constant threat. Not just the physical threat, the geographical proximity, the military threat, right, of live exercises and military drills around your coasts all the time. But again, you live with this kind of constant pressure, cognitive, mental, emotive pressure. Why then are they so resilient despite all of this? They have a very solid civil society infrastructure. So it's not just, individual civil society groups, but it's also really encouraged by the state, by the parties. This is actually rather bipartisan issue in a way, although the perception of the level of threat varies. But they're very proactive, they're very organized, they're very vocal. Organizations like Doublethink Lab that I mentioned before, Taiwan Fact Center, that constantly produce not only the sort of monitoring verification, but also analysis of these instances. Then their government is very fast at acting when it comes, especially on the online sort of cybersecurity side. We can get back to that later. They have a high media literacy. This is something you were pointing to, Jan, right? So it's, it's included in school curricula as one of the core national values. It's not just an accident. It's not just something that's like done now because we feel like we have a incoming threat. It's embedded, right? It's weaved into their school curricula, into the way that the kids think since they're very young. They also rely on their live experience. And this is, I think, where we, in a way, have a weakness in Europe, in that, as I said, they've been the target of CCP propaganda for a long time. So now Taiwanese people have learned how to be skeptical of narratives that are suspiciously timed, especially around elections, right, that are not fact-based, etc. Something that has emerged from one of the studies that I cited before is that in order to be ultimately successful, and this is, I think, a key issue also for us in Europe to learn, China doesn't need Taiwanese people to love the PRC. They just need them not to care enough about Taiwan, about their democracy, their civil freedoms, etc., to not fight in case of unification. And that is a crucial difference. So the aim, again, of the CCP propaganda is not, you should love China. I mean, that's great if you do, but so it's rather undermining your interest, your, how strongly. This is something my colleague Marianne Dahl was talking about on the first event of European Security Week on Monday, right? When she was saying, one of the reasons why Ukrainians are making it so hard for Russia to win this war is because they have a country, they have their freedom and the liberty to fight for. This is, I think, is going to be absolutely crucial in that respect.
Yeah, just referring to what you said about the importance of children and schools and education. In Norway, I think also an example of this already taking place is the fact that we have very strong traditions for voluntary associations and sport clubs and community organizations, which sort of cultivate this idea of inclusion and participation and trust. And these are generally marked by, member democracy, equality. There's a shared decision-making system often, and there is interaction between different ages, different social groups, and we see that kids in this context, from an early age, learn to respect the diverse perspectives and opinions, and to sort of quite early engage constructively in public life, where participation is the goal, and everyone gets a medal. I don't know, but I suspect that this is not as common in Russia, for example, or in China. So this is one example of these very practical or very everyday practices that build social cohesion and also to some extent critical thinking, which are key defenses against these kind of threats. And they remind us that that communities and collective identities are quite powerful forces that also can be mobilized positively.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Jan?
Sorry, just one final remark, if I may here. I want to react to the media literacy that was mentioned here. I want to emphasize also the cyber hygiene practices. That's where the disinformation, cognitive threats, that's where they transpose or translate into the cyberspace. Because in one research that we did recently, and that's almost published right now, we found out that experimentally that people with high cyber hygiene scores are also very good at countering disinformation, discerning disinformation. So this is something that the very practices that you use during the day with your devices and that you are mindful about the cyberspace and cybersecurity makes you also quite resilient in terms of countering disinformation and countering conspiracy mindsets and stuff like this.
Yes, thanks for foreshadowing the next question, actually. So it seems that we can learn a lot, actually, from Taiwan and also from Norway. But yeah, specifically on cybersecurity and also cyber hygiene, maybe I'll give the floor back to you, Jan, directly. How can those help mitigate cognitive threats? And what are these cyber hygiene practices that you just mentioned?
Yeah, there are constant updates. Because you need to update when the security patches come out. You need to change passwords. You need to be mindful about sharing them, not to fall to phishing attacks, stuff like this. It's like 18 basic practices that you can do every day, and that you have to internalize them. So, and the idea is when you internalize these practices, then it makes you more resilient against disinformation and stuff like this, because it all connects to the stuff that we've been talking about, the critical thinking skills and the long-term education. So this is something that can be done by each and every one of us. What is also interesting here in the connection between cybersecurity and cognitive warfare, cognitive threats, is that there are services done by malicious actors online. You have disinformation as a service that you can buy on black market and on the dark web. So it all connects in the cyberspace. That is a huge enabler and a huge empowerment together with the AI that we've talked about. And it all connects here.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask, just because these are individual practices, right? In terms of cybersecurity, are there also more collective practices or policies?
Well, one obvious one would be to emphasize or empower people to use these practices. We have some programs done by national authorities in Czech Republic. They have been doing this cyber academy stuff online, that you can do the course, and it will lead you through all these practices that you can apply, make yourself more safe in cyberspace. Our security forces are quite active in this regard as well. Police is doing some training for the general population. They are trying to be proactive, as well as the banking sector, for example, that tries to call people when they see some suspicious movements on their accounts, when these indicate that they might be under an attack, phishing, smishing, these kind of attacks that malicious actors call you. Please, we need you to confirm your bank account number. We need the security code, the CVC code, and take all your savings and put it into Bitcoin machine. So these are things that the Czech institutions are doing. They are doing it quite effectively, but there are still lots of people who fall to these attackers. And again, there's this asymmetry between the attacking side and the defense side, because we've seen some very sophisticated attacks by malicious actors, the huge groups of organized crime. That one call is from the police officer, of course not the real one, that your account is being attacked. Another call is from the banking officer. And there's this whole process of this whole attack that leads you towards the fact that you take your savings and put it into Bitcoin account of those malicious actors. And you are defenseless in some way, because there's this huge amount of psychological factors that are working against you. A lot of people are working against you. So you need to be, again, very mindful of these things, and be very suspicious, very paranoid, I would say, to survive in this wild, wild west.
So lots of things to be learned from Czechia as well. Ilaria, do you want to add
I
something?
wanted to first react to two of the things that have been mentioned here. The first is that, so something that Jan was talking about now is that I fear that for people that are very digitally competent, all of this is super intuitive. But there's a huge chunks of the population that are not maybe so, that for whom is not maybe not so digitally intuitive, right? To be so cyber hygienic, so to speak.
Yeah, sorry to jump in. This is very interesting, because people who are quite intuitive or trained in IT, those are the people who often fall victims to phishing attacks, to these cybersecurity attacks. I did myself. We had a phishing attack at Masaryk University. And it was really sophisticated, and I didn't notice there's this it's called type squatting, when you change one letter in the email address. And I didn't notice that, and I put my initials in that phishing attack. And yeah, there is this effect, psychological effect, that if you think that you are trained well enough in something, that makes you lower your guard. So this is an interesting effect here.
Thank you. That was actually a really interesting anecdote. Maybe there's some hubris involved in those people who are actually very technically proficient. But I guess my broader point is, again, going back to Stine's question of educating children, is that in order to catch as many people as possible in the high literacy net, then you need to really cover as many people as possible. The sort of related reaction is also that my impression is that these topics are often considered very boring, not very interesting. And I understand that not everybody is interested in the technical aspects of this. But at the same time, and here I go to your question more directly, is that they are, so the cyber aspect, it's an entry point, right, for these influence operations. Not all the time, but most of the time it is an entry point. So we can't just ignore that aspect, I think, as boring and as non-interesting as it might be for some of us, at least. The pattern, again, in Taiwan has been China hacks some of these networks, some of these infrastructures first, and then the manipulation comes in a way almost as a secondary objective, secondary component, right? So, they compromise the IoT devices, they compromise their surveillance cameras, all the connected appliances. This has happened over and over again. And then they use them as proxies for, whatever their strategic objective is. They breach databases, all this kind of stuff. So poor cyber hygiene, as you said, creates the vulnerability and the infrastructure through which cognitive threats actually work in practice. Again, just to give you some numbers, the scale of this is staggering. In Taiwan, just last year alone, they detected over 960 million cyber intrusion attempts. perpetrated by China and China only, of course. That's like 2.5 million per day. More than half of this is exploiting known vulnerabilities. So what can we learn from this, and what kind of policies could governments put in place then? And I think, as you said, both the Czech Republic but also Norway are doing this already, is that having this sort of cybersecurity as part of the national security infrastructure, not as a kind of separate, siloed issue that you need. So it needs to be really part of our sort of total defense mechanism, right? And again, we have, so Taiwan has this sort of, this is all embedded, the information verification idea, both from a kind of emotional side, but also from the technical side, is really embedded also in civil preparedness. So similarly to Norway, in their 2025 Civil Defense Handbook, they specifically, explicitly address cognitive warfare, and they instruct citizens that any message, for example, claiming that Taiwan or the Taiwanese government has surrendered in case of unification should be thought of as false. So these kind of, small practices, as Stina was discussing, I think is basic cyber hygiene, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Please, yes.
I don't know much about cyber or cyber hygiene, but I would like to point to the issue of coordination from the authority side, because there was a recent report from the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats that shows that while there are many good measures to counter disinformation in place across the Euro-Atlantic region, practitioners in the EU and in NATO countries, they largely state that all lines of their counter disinformation work is under-resourced. And the report also points to the fact that there seems to be a general lack of established mechanisms for cooperation between the authorities and the non-governmental sector, that neither of these two sectors fully sees the full picture, which makes it necessary for them to exchange information regularly. And according to the same report, 48% of the hybrid COE's participating states and organizations state that their country does not have a dedicated strategy in place to counter disinformation. And 59% state that their country does not have a dedicated government agency in place to sort of coordinate this work. And less of half of the respondents also evaluate their government's response to disinformation as well communicated and transparent to the public. And this, I think, suggests that there is some room for improvement, let's say, generally. Mm-hmm. And in Norway, or you might know the sectorial principle. I don't know if that's the right translation. Sektorprinsippet in public governance has traditionally been very strong. And this is a principle that ensures that the various sectors have the necessary freedom to carry out their tasks. And it also assigns constitutional responsibility to each individual minister. But there are obviously some areas that require cross-sectoral governance and joint efforts and cooperation across. And I think what we are talking about today is one example of such an issue.
Mm-hmm. Another one, and that will be my last question, because before we open it up to the audience, is communication as well, right? Jan, you already hinted at this a little bit to what works and what doesn't work, right? In terms of countering some of these campaigns. But the broader question would be, how should governments communicate, right? In this kind of uncertain situation for them as well. So how should they communicate with the population? Should they? Well, we know that they shouldn't use counter-arguments or appeal to emotions, right? But on a broader scale, what is the conversation that should be happening between the government and the people to also re-establish trust, right? I'm going to start maybe with Stina, if you want.
Yes. So I've studied or done research on communication for quite a few years, risk threat communication, in particular, how authorities communicate to their public about terror threats. But I think there are some parallels that could be made here. And in general, I think we can say that crisis creates voids. And if this void is not filled with accurate, trustworthy, transparent communication, it's filled with something else. That's a general statement. And one key insight from research I've been involved in is that information habits and trust matters greatly, and that effective societal resilience should take into account where people seek information during a crisis. How they consume news, which institutions they trust, and how they use social media. And in Norway, I think we can say that the conditions for public communication are quite good. We have relatively low levels of polarization. We have a robust media system that also enjoys high levels of trust. And we have a population with a pretty high level of critical media literacy. And as in other countries, the national, the public service broadcaster, so NRK in Norway, play a central role in disseminating official information and also in shaping the preparedness narratives, if we can call it that. And a survey that we conducted a few years ago shows that NRK, so both TV and radio, is used by a large majority of the population to stay informed during a crisis or a situation of uncertainty. So 81%. And 68% state that this is the medium they trust the most. But only 29% say that they would most likely turn to NRK for information if a crisis were to occur. And this is interesting because a full 42% say that they would most likely turn to their families first, friends and families. And I think this might suggest that that trust in normal institutions doesn't automatically translate into behavior in crisis situations, which in turn then, to come back to your question, has implications for how communication strategies should be designed. But in general, I think we can say that more proactive and strategic communication from authorities to the public is a good thing, and maybe especially from the kind of authorities that the public might not be so used to hearing from, but that will possess valuable, potentially life-saving information if a real crisis was to occur.
Do you want to go first, Jan?
Just a quick remark, sorry about that. I wanted to, this is quite dangerous, the fact that people turn to their families and friends, because in Czech context, we've seen that many researchers, that people who take their primary source of information from friends and families, they are ones, not the most, but one of the most susceptible groups to disinformation and to cognitive threats.
Got it?
Do you want to continue? Yeah, I'm just going to go back to something that Stina was just discussing. And I think the Taiwanese example that, again, I'd drawn from in this conversation perhaps suggests that the sort of choice between, reassurance and admitting uncertainty maybe is a bit misleading. And perhaps what works best is transparency, but sort of at speed in a way. I think some of the lessons learned, really, what most precious from Taiwan is, communicate also before crisis. Nobody's expecting, authorities to necessarily predict exactly when a crisis would occur, what kind. Of course, we have intelligence service trying to do some of that, but, just pre-bunking is equally important as post-facto reassurance or communication, right? So again, the example that I gave earlier about the civil defense handbook that says, you should know that no matter what, if unification happens, the government will not have just given up. So that is something that is just one example. But so those kinds of information that citizens should know in event of a crisis, that this and that are definitely true or not, right? And also a second thing that I wanted to stress about trust is that it has to go both ways. So again, another thing that is for me striking about Taiwan is that it's not just people trusting the government, the institution, the civil society, but it's also the government trusts people. It trusts the public with complexity, with handling very complex information, rather than just managing their perceptions. Because that is, I don't think, an approach that can work if you just expect, to manage some emotions that might, flare up at some point. something that the former digital minister in Taiwan, Audrey Tang, at some point argued. She said Taiwan recovered from the trust crisis not by asking people to trust the government, but by encouraging public services to trust the people. So the government has to do its share, but it also leaves, I think, enough space for the people to inform themselves. So I think the practical lessons is perhaps threefold. The first is, again, sort of quick, fast communication, because as Stina said, silence is going to be filled with something, and that something is probably not good. The second is to be honest about what you know and what you don't know, and there are obviously limits to what governments can or cannot say. Giving citizens the frameworks and the tools to make their own decisions, to also verify for themselves, right? To evaluate information for themselves. And then the third, I think, for me, the sort of this idea of pre-bunking, or telling people in advance what kind of disinformation you might expect from certain specific actors. Because the truth is, when it comes to particularly China, Russia, we know what the playbook is about, right? So telling this before, rather than reassuring afterwards, I think it's going to be fundamental.
Anything to add? Yes, Jan?
Yeah, if I may, I would agree, and I have to craft the argument really carefully here. I would agree with the fact that you said that governments should trust their people as well. When or if the governments don't resign on the education. Because if you don't have educated population, then you cannot have faith in it. And it's the Czech context, actually, because in Czech Republic, our schooling system is not that good as in Finland, in Norway, in Taiwan. So this is a dangerous ground to be walking upon. And again, it leads us back to the importance of education. And it's just not good enough, I would say, in Czech Republic right now. And again, I have to really choose my words carefully here. This work can work in Taiwan, in Finland, Norway, Nordics, but it might not work that well in countries that have their education system not as good as in other countries.
Yeah, Stina?
Yes, and I also think that we have to acknowledge that the authorities set to manage these threats are facing quite profound dilemmas in crafting their communication, deciding if they are going to say something, through which channels, how it's framed. And I've studied this mainly in the terror threat context, as I mentioned. But and when I talk to the intelligence services about these kind of dilemmas and how they navigate them, one thing that came up was this fear to create false expectations in the public or for the public. So that and one of them said that we can't go around, how do you say, like confirming or like taking down rumors all the time. Like if there's a terror threat, if there are rumors in social media, for example, about something is going to happen, we can't always be the ones, we don't have the resources. It's completely unrealistic. And then because communication is also not saying something. It's not just about what you say, but the silence is also, when they choose not to say something, that's also an act of communication, I would say. So then if you have authorities that are too active in always, going out and debunking rumors all the time, then that can create false expectations. Then, so let's see, if there is a rumor, it's not being talked about from the authority side, so it's true then. So that's also a dangerous trap, dilemma.
Thank you. Now, we've heard a lot already from the panel, and I've certainly asked a lot of questions, but we have some time before the end of this panel for questions from the audience. There should be microphones, I think, because I'm gonna ask you to introduce yourself and speak into the microphone so that the online participants can also hear us. Yes, we have a first question here.
Veli-Pekka Tynkkönen, University of Helsinki. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I must first say I'm not no specialist in this field, but of course follow these topics very closely in the Finnish context. And I have two questions. First one concerns this how to know challenge, this epistemological, maybe it's for Stine, and AI being a tool here. Is there a competition between different hostile actors, how they frame the way people should know about make decisions? And that's first one. And the second one is a bit more maybe nuanced in a sense that what kind of advice would you give to political actors in the European context, in Western political actors, that actually, if you look at their political agenda, they agree on many topics that China and Russia are narrating. But of course, they don't want to be associated with all the negative stuff related to, for example, Russian narratives. What advice would you give to these parties? Typically, they're in the Finnish context, they are left-wing parties. So what advice would you give them to kind of distance themselves from the narratives? Because I see the problem that they are kind of silent about the fact that actually they are propagating the same narratives that Russia is doing, but shy away from when asked, what about it's the same things that Russia is saying. So what kind of advice would you give to these parties? How could they kind of be respectful political actors while at the same time distancing themselves from these narratives? Thank you.
Thank you. The first question was directly to you, Stine. Do you want to start with that one?
Yes, competition and so on. This is really outside my scope of expertise. So I expect that you are right, but I don't have any details to share. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. No. On the second question, then maybe.
Yes, advice. As I mentioned, I think being proactive in their communication strategies and to establish a clear voice that people recognize could be a very general low cost effort that also goes for other actors and organizations. Yeah, it's a good question, but it's a difficult question. Yeah.
No, go for it.
Again, this is out of my scope as well. I'm more of a cybersecurity guy. But when we were asking the question, the second one, I thought of the broken clock is right twice a day. So there might be some overlaps with like the established parties and the narratives that Russia and China and other rogue actors are pushing. And that's something that we should expect because we cannot expect our narratives and their narratives to be completely different. And acknowledging this, I think, is one step in the process of fighting this, that we have some overlaps. And this is the thing that is done by design. The disinformation are taking something that, I think you mentioned it, that is partially true, and they spin it somehow. So this is something that cannot be avoided, I would say.
No, I mean, you ask very important questions. I can attempt just to say something building on my colleagues as they were talking. I had at least I could think a little bit longer. So on the competition of narratives, I agree with Jan, and you know, in a way, misinformation can come from any. It doesn't just come from malicious actors. So we obviously we're talking about that specifically in a context of cognitive warfare, but elements of cognitive warfare can come, I mean, from your own government. Think about Trump, just to name one. But be very open and explicit about it. But and I just have to go back to what I said earlier. So this cannot, the influence campaigns, in a way, they exploit this pre-existing collapse of trust. So I think that, really the most important thing that can be done then also to fight these or navigate these competing narratives is then to rebuild really trustworthy media, institutions, transparency. And I know it sounds easier said than done. On the second question, I think, so this has been a frustration of mine working on China for a long time in Europe, because unfortunately, unlike in Taiwan and perhaps elsewhere in the world where China's presence and malicious activities have been obvious for a longer time, I don't think in Europe we really have awakened to that just yet. Not to the level that I, as a China scholar, wants to see. And again, going back to Taiwan, there it's just so obvious that in a way it's just, they don't even think about it. They know it's there and they know the threat is there and what forms it takes. Whereas here, unfortunately, we still think of China also as an economic partner. And I know that is the case, and many political parties in Europe, especially on the left, are linked also historically to China. This is also, I've worked on Africa for a long time. These people have been trained in China for a long time. So of course, some of these narratives are very hard to, in a way, disentangle from the sort of politics of this. But I think we just have to alert ourselves that this is a real threat. And I will add, and then open up again, that Russia has been the foremost threat actor in Europe for a long time. But we know from evidence that they are working with China. They are teaching China tactics for influencing Europe and not just Taiwan. So it's not like, so what I draw from Taiwan, but it's not just a faraway example from the other side of the world. This is something that China has increasingly been doing alongside Russia. That's all I guess I have to say.
Right, thank you. Are there more challenging questions for our panelists? Yes, please.
Hello. My name is Alexandra Haugstad. I work at the Research Council of Norway, so not a specialist in your field, but let's say kind of from a perspective of a engaged citizen. I listened, it was very interesting to hear your discussions, and to this topic of this erosion of trust and kind of what are the drivers and what can be done. I would like to ask a question about the platforms and where this digital discussion, public discussion is happening. And let's say kind of it's mainly happening in on kind of big tech owned platforms where we have, so yeah, just kind of to throw this out kind of, and this erosion of trust in the latter years. I'm thinking about the figures Stina was mentioning for Norway. The public debate in Norway has moved into a digital space where people are not safe. Kind of the level kind of you will be scammed. Kind of back in the day you would go out into the street and you would feel safe. Now you go out into the digital space and you have to expect to be scammed by people who look like kind of your friends, but then they're not. Kind of, is this affecting the levels of trust? I mean, it should, right? Mm-hmm. So if we're moving, if a public debate, which is the basis of democracy, is happening in an unsafe environment, what is kind of, can we do anything about this? And just to say, kind of, I just checked, my institution, your institution, kind of PRIO, Research Council of Norway, Trondheim, Oslo Kommune, the government, kind of all have a presence in, for example, Facebook. Are we legitimizing these platforms? Are we keeping users who might kind of prefer to move out into a safer environment in this space by our kind of practices? Just kind of, are there any advice and moves and things that could be done?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, as regards our first question about the platforms, one thing we can do and that the European Union has been doing is pushing regulation, hard regulation, and it's effective to some point. Another thing that can be done is via civil society. In Czech Republic, we have some civil society groups that are actively engaging with the audience online on platforms such as Facebook. And they try to educate political actors how to moderate their content on their profiles. And it has shown some effects already. And politicians are slow to pick up this. But it also already showed some effects. When you do online content, you get a lot of engagement in Facebook, and you can, as a rule of thumb, basically discern a profile that is not healthy by those reactions, the haha reactions, and the angry reactions that are disproportionately over the top of the liked reactions, the love reactions, and stuff like this. And by moderating those profiles profoundly, you can lower those reactions, those negative reactions, not by pushing some kind of censorship, but by discerning what is an actual person that reacts to your content and what is a bot, because you have a lot of automation going in the space, and keeping these profiles healthy has a profound impacts on the communication, how the communication is led on those platforms. This dates back decades, and we are just now picking it up. In Czech Republic, when the internet was starting, or the proliferation of internet was starting in the 2000s, there were discussions online with Russian intelligence services pushing disinformation campaigns and influence operations so that they poisoned the discussions. And it took us 20 or so years to react on that and to finally start doing something on the defense. So this is something that, again, can be done from civil society, as well as some kind of bottom-up process to complement the top-down process of pushing regulation. So this is something that can be done on a platform side of things.
Yes, I think you're pointing to something really, really important and fundamental, and our dependency to all these platforms and technologies are something that we should be talking a lot more about in general, I think. And I would say that my answer or approach to this might come across as a bit naive, but I still think it's important. I think we need to think about and create meeting places, arenas where people can meet face to face. We need to have more meetings like this, less meetings with our faces on the screen. So create arenas whenever we can, where people can meet face to face, exchange opinions. This is something that can, in itself, increase social cohesion and work on as a way of decreasing polarization. And I think I mentioned it earlier, to attempt to normalize disagreement. I don't think we are. I think there's a tendency to think that we should. I mean, we don't always have to agree on everything, but we have to normalize disagreement in public debate. To, for example, limit the risk of having your opinions labeled as fake news just because someone doesn't like them. And I also think one approach to this is, as I also mentioned before, this tradition of voluntary associations and sport clubs and community organizations, civil society organizations, the work that they are doing to include and recruit and create these kind of arenas where people can meet face to face, basically, is an important effort.
Mm-hmm.
Jump in.
Yes, please, Jan.
I'm really sorry. I just realized I didn't answer your second question. I have a memory of a fish, so please excuse me. When it comes to internet and being an unsafe place, this is the thing that is done by design. Internet was not built by us as a safe space. So we have to leave the notion of ever thinking of internet as a safe space. And what we can do is just post hoc measures that we can safeguard to some extent, but internalize the thing. We should internalize the thing that internet is not a safe space and will not be a safe space, and that's something that is done by design, unfortunately.
Oh, you asked a fantastic question. Thank you. Okay, I will not touch on the sort of specific issue of platforms because my colleagues already addressed that very well, and I agree with what both of them said. I just wanted to say, though, if I could just lift up the conversation again. So two things, actually. So what I mentioned earlier about AI-enabled or sort of social media in general, if you don't want to talk about AI specifically, about sort of exacerbating things that already really exist. Perhaps in a sort of as a provocation, I can say, in a way, none of these threats are new. It's just that they move from one space to the other. There is a real risk of like multiplication, speed and scale, which we discussed. But really, at the very bottom, of the very core, the threat is in a way the same. Related to that, then again, I want to lift the conversation up. So we talked about the battle of narratives, if you will. So what is all of this misinformation, disinformation about? Really telling us, from my perspective, that democracy isn't as good as we thought it was. And then on the other hand, you have a narrative that's telling us, well, this other model of governance, of governing not just law, but, society and interactions is better. Look at how we do things. It works much better. I think we really need to get people enamored with democracy again, not as an end in itself, but as a means to really live in a better society where we are transparent and we trust each other.
Thank you. Any more questions? We have a bit more time. No burning questions. Our panel has answered all the questions, I believe. And I think the last words by Ilaria are a good last words to this discussion that we were having, right? And a good call for democracy. So thank you all for coming this morning. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Stine, Ilaria, and Jan, for being here this morning and for answering all our questions, and we'll give them a round of applause, I think.